Thank you. The question that people always ask me is, well, how do you know which books to review? How do you decide? And the problem is even bigger than most people know. I remember being astonished when I first went to the book review at the number of books that come into the book review. It's something like 1,000 a week. And in fact, there was a clerk in those days whose job it was for about half the day, he spent half the day just opening the mailers that the books came in. The other half of the day he spent at the Times Square strip bars. But he put in a good half day's work. And these books were then dumped into these big laundry carts, you know, the canvas thing, and they pushed them through the book review up to my office. And I knew it was time to step down when I began dreaming about the books.
Did you make the first cut?
Yeah, what happened is that the once a week, they'd move these laundry carts in and I would pitch.
I was often there. They called it moving units.
Moving units.
And Chip would take the ones he didn't want to keep, and there was some bins, and he had not perfect aim always, but throwing them across the room into the bin.
Well, and a lot of it was no-brainer. I mean, a lot of the books, frankly, should never have been sent to book review in the first place.
Yeah, those kind of.
They were astrology books and diet books, and I mean, but there were other things, and you did have to make, sadly, quick decisions. Though not that quick. I would give most things the benefit of the doubt. In those days, and I think it's still true, the book review had this tremendous resource, unlike any other book review, I think, on the planet, which is it had a staff of a half dozen people who were preview editors. Dwight was one. And the job of the preview editors was each, at the end of this session where I would pitch the books that I didn't want, I'd give each of the preview editors a big stack of books. And then they would go off and actually read them, or look at them anyway. So that a lot of our decisions on what to review and whether to review were based on, you know, someone actually taking a look at a book, which is a great luxury. So the question I have for you two now is, how do you decide? You want to start?
Yeah, but I don't have such an intelligent answer. I don't have a preview edit.
That's what I mean. I figured.
Yeah. And I have a book reviews editor, and very often he will, and you might possibly be grateful for this, he will ask me to do a book because he thinks the subject is interesting.
This is Leo Carey?
Yes, this is Leo. I'm not Leo. Leo's my editor.
Okay.
Henry Finder.
Right.
Henry Finder is actually, I think, his title is executive.
Yeah,
But he is the man who offers me the books. Yeah.
well, I just had a piece in the New Yorker, and I worked with Henry, and it's interesting because for most of the time I was at the New Yorker, the books editor was Edith Oliver, who was better known probably as the off-Broadway theater critic. And what would happen there in those days was all the books would go to Edith's office and they'd get shelved on these bookcases. And I don't think Edith ever actually read any of them. But she would go and kind of run her hands over them, maybe take one down and kind of flip it through. But she had an unerring instinct. And what she would do is, she basically, in those days, the New Yorker had just a handful of book critics, all first rate. There was Edmund Wilson, and then when Wilson died, George Steiner, Updike, V.S. Pritchett. And she had an unerring knack for picking books that would appeal to them. She was like feeding their habits. And it resulted in a kind of funny system. It was a lot of wonderful book reviews happened in those days, especially if you ask me the ones by Pritchett and Updike. But it was kind of scattershot, and still is. And not only that, books weren't. Edith would assign them, but William Shaw, the editor, would be the one who scheduled them. He would sometimes hold on to a book review for a year until the book was practically out of print. And I think he enjoyed doing that. I think he didn't want to be part of the business of hype. But it seems to me these days it's a little eccentric still, which is good, but there's more of an effort to be up to date, isn't there?
Well, I've only been at the New Yorker for 20 years.
Okay. Well, I mean, since Henry.
No, but the thing is, yes, they tried to make them more timely. Also, you may have noticed the New York Review of Books, famous for holding reviews for 2 years or so, is trying to get them out all the time. I mean, you know, what can I say? There goes the neighborhood, you know. But lots of times a book is chosen, I know because I get on the phone with Henry and say, what are you interested in this book you've sent over to me? And he'd say, but what hasn't happened is that he hasn't read the book.
I was going to say, Henry is amazing. He's read everything.
Yeah, well, yes, but pretty fast, okay?
Yeah, I know. He's better than Edith.
But I sometimes will, I've learned to read them when he sends them over rather than waiting for when I would start work on the book. Because if you hang on to the book and don't give it back, and then start like 2 or 3 weeks beforehand, in other words, when you really need to start, if you find out the book is bad, you can't give it back. Or maybe you can, but it's not nice, okay? You've got to give him, if he was interested in that author or that subject, you've got to, you know, if you'd like to keep your job, and then it would be nice to give him the opportunity to give it to somebody else. By the way, also there's the fact, was true in your time, if the reviewer turned it down, you get in the wastebasket.
Almost always. Because at the New Yorker, then, and I think still now, there's not a presumption that any one book has to be reviewed. And I think that brings us to the Times, where certainly at the book review, and I would think at the Daily, I mean, there's a presumption that certain books are going to be reviewed by the New York Times. I mean, they have to be. It's part of the Times' journalistic mission. So that brings me to you. So in the old days, if you were making assignments, do you make your own assignments now, or do you, how is it?
I do. There are 3 daily critics. I mean, I think most of you probably know there are daily book critics at the Times. Then there's a separate Sunday book review, which uses freelancers. And there are 3 of us at the Daily, and we sort of work out among ourselves. We pick several months in advance what we're going to each do. I was going to add to the initial conversation that I get about 20 to 50 books a day in the mail, and they just pile up. And I remember once when I was living in Frenchtown, New Jersey, this was about 3 years ago, it was a hot summer weekend, and my wife and my kids went away. And we had to leave our dogs for some reason. We had people checking on them, but the dogs were in the house. And the dogs were barking, and the mail piled up out front, 300 books. And someone knocked on my neighbor's door and said, I think the people who live there are dead. Dogs barking, mail everywhere. So, and I'm sure that now I'm an annoyance to the people in my apartment building because they just really stack up. But what I do with them all is that I bring them up and open them, which takes a lot of my time, actually. But as Chip said,
you need a guy that will go to do it.
I don't have that. I'm no guy. I used to torture my kids to make them do it when they, but you toss away the weight loss manuals and the books on gardening, which we don't really review. I'm not the kind of books that I do. But then it gets really difficult. I'm about to pick my books for February.
So you work a month in advance?
A month or 2 in advance.
Or 2.
So I'm about to do February. I've done January. December is a very quiet month, so people.
I'm sorry, Dwight, you actually take 1 month to review the book.
No. I'm picking the books, the 4 or 5 books I'll do in February, I'll pick now. And I often call late audibles. I'll find a book later that seems better, or I'll drop one, but I'll pick my slate. And I'll do that, though, by going to the shelf, and I only get to review, I review 1 a week, so it's 5 a month. And of that 5, 2 or 3 will just jump off the shelf at me because there's a new Martin Amis book, or just someone that I love. There's a new book by, I don't know, Laurie Moore. There's just a name, I have to do that. And the problem is, as a critic, you have better eyes for the names you know than for the great young person coming up. So the hard part of the job, the easy part of the job, is to pick 5 books that are just either A, great writers, or B, topics that I happen to love. I don't know what that might be, but a biography of someone, or, The hard part that I try to force myself to sit down and do is to get a pile of books by small publishers, books that you've never heard of, and spend at least 20 15, 20 minutes with them. I mean, just trying to flip around. I have a funny trick that I do sometimes where if it's a book by what I think of as a pretty minor, negligible publishing house that I have no reason to think this will be any good, I often mentally read the first page and try to format it in New Yorker typeface. I imagine I open the New Yorker and I'm reading, this is a short story in the New Yorker. Is it plausible? And that's the first step sometimes, and that will lead me on. But anyway, it's hard. It's hard to find.
What about the kind of mediocre book or even the lousy book that nevertheless has to be done? And I'm thinking, for example, you reviewed the new Bob Woodward book, which I think is mediocre, and yet it had to be done, right? There's no way that the New York Times cannot review that book.
Right, but in terms of Bob Woodward, you're not talking about aesthetics, really.
Yeah.
Because he's a pretty terrible writer, but he's great factually, you know. He admits that. I mean, if he were here, he would not even mind that as a criticism. Not very much, anyway. But it's what he, you know, it's the stuff that he has. So, and there's so much stuff that's supposed to talk about with Woodward and Trump and what's happening in America. That's just a juicy, that's just red meat, no matter what.
Right.
And so I was happy to do that. The hardest reviews to write, and I know both Chip and Nancy know this, is the book that's just, you know, averagely funny, averagely interesting, just that kind of middle book, which most books are middle books. So it's a funny way to talk about them without putting readers into a coma.
So here's a question, which I don't know the answer to. Back when I was the editor of the book review and the daily review were completely separate, completely different entities, which there are historical reasons for that, and each made its own decisions, and it often looked as if the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. In fact, that was the case, and it resulted in a kind of crazy system where some books got reviewed twice, some books didn't get reviewed at all. Nowadays, it's the last couple of years, a single person, Pamela Paul, is the head of both. And is there more of an effort? So if you and Jennifer and Perul decide not to review something, will she make sure it gets done in the Sunday paper? How's that work, or do you even know?
It's interesting. The daily critics, they pretty much don't tell us what to do. And actually, they never do, as a matter of fact. But they will suggest once in a while. They'll say, you know, no one at the Sunday is doing this. Maybe you guys would consider it. But no one has asked me or forced me to do something. What will happen is that I will learn that there's a major new biography coming out, and Pamela Paul, who edits the book review, will say, well, Chip is reviewing it. And I might say to myself, well, I don't want to compete. Whatever he writes is going to be great. And A, I don't want to compete with him, and B, our taste, we're a little bit similar in our taste. But I just feel like maybe since Chip is doing it, maybe I shouldn't do it as well. I'll think that. Or I'll find out that Pete Wells, the New York Times restaurant critic, is reviewing some new book about Craig Claymore or something. And I really want to do that, but you know, Pete is pretty great, and maybe just one of us on Craig Claymore is enough for America. So I will think about that. That's about it. That's, you know.
So do the daily critics fight among themselves, or?
No, we're pretty.
They used to.
Yeah. And then.
It takes some politicking, but we work it out.
Yeah.
And Jennifer, there are three of us. It's myself, Parl Seghal, and Jennifer Zalai. And Jennifer Zalai is the nonfiction critic alone. And Parl and I both do primarily fiction, but also some nonfiction. So.
Yeah. How do you pick? One thing I'm always interested in, but this is the Sunday book review, is the pages in this debut novel. Who picked the debut novel? Do you go out to lunch with the editors? I mean, you don't know. You're saying you already know that Laurie Moore's book is going to be good, but how do you pick a debut novel?
You have to look at it. I mean, because the publisher will tell you that everything's great. So
no, exactly. I get these things from Norton. You know, the
do you see books coming from Norton that have your name written all over them? Do you call the New Yorker and suggest them?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't. Henry has what he wants covered. If I say to him, as I did, that I want the Arundhati Roy new book. It took her 20 years to do it, and I want that book. And if I send him an email so he can remember it, I think everybody, I guess this is wrong, but it is marginally better to have somebody review a book who likes the book. Okay? It's not a good idea to start, to spend the magazine's time and space on something that the writer knows she thinks is lousy.
So, but what both of you are saying is that you're not susceptible to pressure.
No.
What pressure?
I mean, the publishing industry spends an enormous amount of time and energy trying to publicize itself. And one of the most tedious parts I used to find of being the editor of the book review was that you were obligated, so the various publishing houses every season would send somebody to the book review with the catalog to like walk me through the catalog as if I couldn't read it myself. I used to hate these things.
I don't do them.
And, but you know, I felt some obligation of courtesy or something, where you just let them have their say. But and I think there are cases where pressure is put.
I had dinner once with, I'm not going to mention the name of the publisher, but the editor, whom I was sitting with, was Barbara Epstein, my editor at the New York Review of Books. And this guy, quite cheerfully, with no sense of shame or whatever, was telling Barbara not only which books he had them in his briefcase, and he had carefully chosen only like 10, he also knew who should review it. He said, this would be perfect for Pankaj Mishra or something like this. And I walked Barbara home after this, and I said, Barbara, that guy was actually telling you not just to assign the book, but who to assign it to. And she said, you would not want my job.
Well, no, I've been told that, or was told that back in the day, Bob Silver's, it was expected if you came and you were from a university press and you came and had your interview with Bob, who was much more patient, clearly, than I was, but he wanted your suggestions that we should review. That was part of the publicists used to spend all-nighters before they would go and meet with Bob.
So maybe that's what Bob got me to review that Fosse book. Anyway, don't you want to know whether women get different assignments? I'll meet you in the alley. No, if you are, I mean, I'm sure this problem didn't happen to systems on tape, but I have had repeatedly to say, I don't want all the cooking and childbearing books. It's not just because I have a child, I don't cook, but I have, but also because because of my something about my personality, that I'm more likely to be able to make a joke or something like this. It's not like having Hannah Arendt review your book. And but you do have to, if you're a woman, it'll be different in 20 years. But I did have to call up and be your presence.
Let's back up a bit. And so what is the purpose of these things anyway, book reviews? Why do we have them? What should they do?
Well, you got sort of three levels working at once in the New York Times. One is purely an announcement, this thing is here. You know, for many people, a review in the New York Times is the first they've heard of the book. So, in a way, I like to be first as a critic. The New York Times is often first with its books. And so I like that sort of announcement factor. You're just hearing about this for the first time. Here it is. Chip said something interesting the other day we were talking. He said, we're talking about whether it's important for a critic to call balls and strikes, meaning really let the reader know if they feel strongly one way or another. And I go back and forth on this. I'm kind of leaning as a Times critic to thinking this probably is fairly important. But I always think about something that H.L. Mencken once said, which is, he said that making the thing, meaning making the review, charming is more important than making it true. And what he meant was, everyone has an opinion. Everyone could be, your uncle, your crazy uncle could be right about 8 things. You don't want to hear him talk about them, right? You don't want to hear him review them. So what a critic brings is a voice and linkages and showing something, why it matters, why it doesn't matter, what it might mean to the culture, bringing some other material to bear. So a critic's job, you know, is sort of many layered for the New York Times in a way. Probably somewhat different for the New Yorker, and you have much more space in the New Yorker for another thing.
Well, generally they don't make me go under 3,500.
I have 900 words, maybe 1,000 published.
And I don't want to, because it's not so much that I want that much space. Sometimes, but the other day I was writing a piece on Luther on the birthday of the 99 Theses, and I should never have taken the review because there were 3 books that had to be reviewed, and then there were all the other books on Luther. And you can't take Luther, it's not like taking a cooking book or something like that. I hope there are no cooks out there, but you can't not know what the situation was, with the Pope. That you can't make a lot of mistakes. But I'm doing a book right now. Once again, I don't think I'm going to say who it is, but you'll see it in about 2 weeks. But the book is not that good. It's just that I wanted to talk about the guy. I wanted to talk about the son. My friend said, who knows the subject of this book is Edward Gorey. A guy who was a friend of Gorey's said to me, Joan, the book is not that good. And I said, but I want to write about Gorey, and I don't know when I'll have another chance. And Gorey was an art, he's famous for his art books above all, but he was a tremendous ballet fan. So he and I have something in common. There's some of his language that I understand quite well. But I do. For example, that book by Arundhati Roy that I said I requested 6 months in advance or something like that, on the basis of having read her first book, which was published 20 years before, was nowhere near as good. The second book was nowhere near as good as the first book. But Tunisia was so important, and India was that important, and the Indian novel, and and Modi, and everything going on there, that even though the book wasn't that good, and frankly, it should have been somebody who didn't have to do a lot of homework on India, which I did. Still, I wanted to write about it.
Well, you're bringing up an interesting topic, because reviewing movies like I do, the work you're seeing is often the tip of the iceberg in terms of the work, because if there's a, if there's a new novel from X, and I haven't read the first 6 novels that he or she has written, I will often go back and read the bulk of those. And I won't say that I read every page of every one, but it's a heavy week. And this week, for example, tomorrow morning, I'm reviewing a book of poems. It's happening, I feel like I'm on vacation all week, because it took half an hour to read, and I just read it. But often, there'll be 90 hours of reading to do before I write these. Other weeks, an hour or two, so I'm
Well,
sure it'll be fine.
that Luther thing was just,
I can imagine.
never do that one. I mean, actually, I do like to write about the history of religion. That's why Henry asked me to do it. But, and for one thing, basically I know about the Catholics, not about the Protestants. But the business of the homework, which is very interesting. And, now, who was it? Henry told me the other day, what's the name of the guy, the famous book reviewer, Human Stain, the guy on whom the hero of the Human Stain.
Anatole Broyard.
Anatole
That's
Broyard.
not based on.
Yeah, wow.
Okay, all right, okay. His daughter's written in, I know. But all right, Anatole Broyard, and was he at the Voice? Is that?
No, it was at the Times.
It was at the Times. He would go, Henry Finner tells me that Anatole Broyard would go into the room where the books were and go through them and pick the thinnest one. Which is what I should have done with the Luther.
So it's interesting, and I think reviewing, it's complicated, it falls between these two extremes. On the one hand, you're talking about a kind of review that you're using the book as a jumping off point for a discussion of a subject, something. Frankly, those are the kinds of reviews I most like to read myself. On a newspaper, you've got this problem of you're a newspaper.
Well,
But I want to qualify what I said about balls and strikes. It used to drive me bananas. There's a kind of newspaper reviewing, it's less prevalent now, where the balls and the strikes would be called in the very first sentence. You know, this crappy book, this waste of wood pulp.
That is up until very recently.
Yes, and that's kind of crazy. But I also think that, and I felt this way when I was at the book review, that a little bit, if you're a newspaper reviewer or even a Sunday book reviewer, you are partly a consumer guy, right? You've got to offer a verdict.
yeah, and I review a lot of books as well, just because I love the topic and I want a reason to talk about it. But the Times, you have 900 words. I mean, I often compare it to sort of buying like figs or peaches at a farmer's market. You have this small container to put them in, and you have 30. And what's better, to have 5 perfect peaches in there, cramming 30 of them. And when I first started as a critic, I would try to get every fact from biography in there, and I realized that wasn't the way to go at all. And so now I single out the 4 or 5 things I really want to say and try to fit them in there perfectly. It's just something I learned over time.
What do you do about the mistakes? You're doing a biography style, for example.
The mistakes you find in a biography.
That's right.
Well, you gloss over them unless there's a real reason to point them out. Unless there are many, unless it seems like a real...
Well, then you might go back to your editor and say, I don't know about this book. But in your average biography, I find there's a significant number of mistakes. They're trying to get the book out. I generally find that, and I do it myself, they get collected in the penultimate paragraph. And then comes the nevertheless paragraph.
Yeah.
Even so.
Yeah, exactly, even so, or nevertheless.
There's a quality of preening if you sort of, single out these nitpicky errors, which you don't want to do, which I know you agree with that. But if they're serious errors, yeah,
But the thing is, what if they're not that serious? What if, I don't know, they misspell the ballet term, and stuff.
Well, if it's consistent, then you have to mention it, I think.
But it seems to me, if I was your editor, and I used to be yours,
You were mine too. The first piece I wrote for the New Yorker, the Nijinsky.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay. I would urge both of you, what I always did as an editor, is, for God's sakes, let's keep the reader in mind. I mean, the point is, does the reader, are these mistakes that make a difference to the reader of the review? Or is this just something that you're getting off on, showing your superiority to the author and so on?
Well, when I first heard the word mistakes, I thought you meant mistakes that you or I would commit. And the New Yorker has this epic fact-checking regime. But at the New York Times, I check my own facts, and it's a big part of the job. And one thing that's really changed for journalists and writers in the internet age is readers now have access to complaint immediately. It used to take 2 weeks to write a letter, so we get a stamp, go to the post office, the letter would arrive a week later, maybe they'd run it. Now, within the first hour after a review of mine goes online, if it's some topic that's a nonfiction topic, there's always an assistant professor of something of that topic. You can't believe that I would dare trespass on his area. And there's always some little, qualification of fact that he wants to make. And I spend 2 hours explaining that no, I actually do have it right. But it's a time suck almost all the time. I bet the New Yorker it never comes into play for you.
No, well, what happens is, the time suck. Very often, if you're working with a translation, I review translations of Italian, but I remember I reviewed a translation of Chaucer, and I do read Middle English. They made us. When I was an English major at Berkeley, you had that course. And somebody wrote it and said, and it was about it was from The Merchant's Tale, if anyone knows. I'm sorry, it was from The Miller's Tale, if anyone knows what that's like. It's an extremely pornographic story. and the man wrote in, assistant professor of Middle English, blah, 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 blah. You have it wrong, the hairs, blah, blah, blah. Well, at the New Yorker, they do not check, unless you've been called a racist or something like that, they do not check with you now. Or, I'm sorry, they do not check with me about whether they're going to publish the letter.
Oh,
Or unless it's a very sensitive business. I remember writing about recurrent memory. They did check all, they did show me all the ways.
At the New York Times, getting a correction is like getting a speeding ticket. You don't get one for 3 years, and then bang, 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 you're
Yeah.
in a row. Which I'm kind of in the middle of one of those tears right now, so I'm hoping tomorrow.
No, and at the paper, it's a great stain of humiliation. You gotta
It
get rid of.
really is.
You
I
can't-
have a question for you about working with the New York Times. When I came to work at the Times, I was an assigning editor under Chip. I assigned
But
fiction.
let me stop this and say, this is the greatest hire I ever made. A lot of people say the only good one. And in which, if that's true, then it made up for all.
But Chip would give me a pile every week I have to go read. And I would come back to him and tell him which ones were the good books worth assigning, and then we would talk about who to give a book to. So I would call up, I would have the Richard, this is a good example, so I want to get to this example.
This is really Richard Ford and Colson.
Yeah, well, okay, well see, Chip came to the book review having edited the great writers, this extremely venerated literary editor of fiction at the New Yorker. So he came into the book review knowing most of the major writers in America. And so, anyway, I assigned this book by Richard Ford, a friend of Chip's, to Colson Whitehead. Colson Whitehead reviewed it so negatively that Richard Ford later spat on him, and like, that's how negative the review was.
Wow.
But Chip, I remember I came in, you were very nonplussed. I mean, it was your good friend, but I'm wondering how at the book review, often enough reviews would come in by people you were quite close with that were exceedingly negative, and you were always, but I'm wondering how you dealt with.
Well, it was hard. And I remember this cost me several years. Richard is a great grudge holder, and this particular review cost me several years of frostiness. We're now back on good terms. But what are you going to do? I felt that my job as editor of the book review had to, and that this sort of journalistic ethics had to take priority over personal friendships. And yes, and I some friendships I had were lost. But I felt strongly that I couldn't tell a reviewer how to review a book. And it happened all the time that I would send a book out, or you would, and the review would come back, and it would be something I profoundly disagreed with. Either the person disliked a book that I thought was really estimable, or vice versa. This person was raving about something that was mediocre. And I felt I couldn't, as an editor, I couldn't change the verdict. I could argue, well, you have this particular argument, you need to beef up with more evidence, or maybe don't you want to think twice about this particular sentence, tone it down.
What was the phone call you would make to Richard Ford, or what was the
I never made the phone call. I never made the phone call. I didn't think I could do it. Now, I will say that...
Not a job, anyway, yeah.
I will say that about a half a dozen times, I either killed or reassigned a book review. And I always did it for a reason. Either I thought the review was just so shabbily, slovenly written that I couldn't tolerate it, or because I thought it was out of line. I thought that it was unfair. Not wrong, but unfair. And every time I did it, there was hell to pay, because the reviewer whose review I've turned down or so on, and then sees the book reviewed later by someone else, assumes that I'm in, assumes that political reasons I'm in the can, and that gets said and so on. But I felt at the time, more so than when I was at the New Yorker, I felt this real ethical burden, I guess you'd call it, because of the Times being what it is, the power, the immense power that the New York Times had then. I think, sadly, we can talk about this later if you want, I think the power of the Times in a book reviewing media in general is kind of sadly diminished. But even so, a good notice in the Times, in the Daily or the Sunday, can make a world of difference to a writer. And that power, I think, you have to wield very carefully. And, you know, that also gets, the other principle at the Times was the whole business about conflict of interest. The Times is very chary of people seeming to have any connection with one another. And the rule used to be, basically, that you couldn't review someone's book if you'd ever been in the same room with that person, and you couldn't review a book if you and that author shared the same publisher. And I loosened up on that a little bit, because that's cuckoo.
I thought you told me once that, I remember asking someone to review a book, and they said, no, I can't review, you know, let's just imagine, I call Joyce Carol Oates and I ask her to review a Paul Auster novel, and Joyce Carol Oates says, oh, you know, I know Paul. And Chip would say, well, find out if she knows the names of his kids, because, you know, how close could you be if you don't know the names of someone's kids? Someday that came up with someone. But Frank Rich once took me, the great theater critic, New York Times, took me out for a drink when I first became a critic at the Times. And I sort of said, well, Frank, you know, what advice do you have to have a career at the Times that's anything like yours? He said, well, don't have any friends. which you know, I have plenty of friends. But what he meant was, don't make new literary friends, because it hurts you and it hurts them. It hurts readers. So many critics in various fields are compromised by who they can and can't talk about, and it's best just to stay off that field.
I don't ever go backstage after a show, which a lot of people are insulted by. Not to see, you know, not to be congratulated, and I tend to avoid parties. I have that kind of personality. I don't like parties anyway. but it's, all it is trouble. I went backstage and congratulated somebody on what she had done, and then went off and for Art in America wrote a very severe article on what she had done.
Yeah,
and what was she supposed to say to herself, you know? It's stupid.
I found myself saying, you know, writers are my people. I love writers more than any other people on the planet. And it hurts me because there are people I would like to be friends with. The great New Jersey poet in my mind, maybe there are many to choose from, is Augie Kleinzahler. And he took me for a drink once. We had a great drink in Hoboken on the waterfront. And we had such a nice time. I said, look, if we do this again, we can't do this, or if we do this again, I can't write about you. So we have to decide right now. And we decided we have a light email friendship, but I'm not going to see him anymore because I love his work and he deserves to be written about it. But it's hard to make decisions like that.
What do you do about, so you've reviewed somebody's book, and you give it a bad review and you know it's been hurtful, and then this author's next book comes along. I mean, then do you feel some burden to try to be, how do you get over that, the burden to try to be nicer? Or
that just came up because I'm a big fan of Jonathan Letham's fiction. He's the author of Motherless Brooklyn.
It was a brand new book.
He has a brand new book, and I didn't like his last one, and I know him just a little bit from way back, not well enough that I see him work. But and I like him. He's a good guy. He's a smart guy. He's ingenious. And he's generous. Is a writer as well as a person. And I didn't like his last novel very much. And the new one, which I reviewed last week, I didn't like at all, and I was very negative about it. But you know, this is the job I have. If I'm not going to tell the truth, I should pack it up. You know, I can't soften. I don't want to be a cruel person, but I want to talk as if I'm talking to all of you, as if I'm talking to Chip. As if Chip said, "How's that book?" I want to answer like that. I mean, you know, and I want to tell people what I really think. And if you're not prepared to do that, this is not right.
You're braver than I am. I think so. Years ago, when I was at the New Yorker, I reviewed The Western Canon by Harold Bloom, whom I studied with. I was even a protege of, and it was a very negative review. And he was not happy. He felt personally betrayed.
Of course.
And then a couple years ago, the book review called me up and asked me to review the big Shakespeare book, and I chickened out because I thought I know I'm probably not going to like this book, and I don't want to go down that road again.
I think I assumed I would like the new novel.
Yeah, I do guessing. I don't like any longer, this shows my age, I don't really like writing terrible reviews, very harsh reviews anymore. For one thing, the New Yorker only reviews one book a week. And I just wonder whether, I mean, short of, you know, sometimes there are very good reasons. For example, the whistleblowing reason, which is this is an over-inflicted reputation.
Well, it's amazing the feedback and I get. When I review a book negatively, I mean, pretty negatively. I get an amazing reaction from people across the world. I think part of the reason is that literary talk has become happy talk to a fairly large degree. Negative reviews, there are fewer than there used to be. And I think every reader has experience of being burned by hearing about this great book and going out and spending $27 and having it be crap. That when they read something that comports with their sense often of just, I can't believe people like this, there's this great, I end up getting inundated with letters when I write a negative review. Sometimes positive reviews as well. But I do worry that, I look sometimes at the books the Times staffers, the three of us as daily critics, have reviewed, just say 3 months back, realize that they're maybe 80% positive, 90%. This can't be right. I mean, there are not enough good books to review positive.
Well, remember, you're partly picking and choosing. I was very aware when I was at the book review of this huge problem, and I think it's a problem with reviewing fiction much more than with nonfiction. And the trouble is that the Times then, I tried to get away from it, but it's kind of impossible. And now, still in the Sunday review, as often as not, fellow novelists are asked to review novels. Well, the fix is kind of in when that happens, because even...
Are they more merciful?
Oh, much. They're not going to... It's the Guild.
So they were in Iowa with these...
Well, no, they don't have to have been friends or anything. It's just you're not... if you're a novelist, you know how bloody hard it is to write a novel and how slimly the chances of success are. You're not going to trash.
And Chip knows the other big problem with fiction reviews in the Times is that, you would assign a major book, even not to another novelist, to a good critic, or let's not say a good critic, not someone, and you would call them up a week before it was due and say, how's the book? And they would say, awful. Sir. Then the review would come in, because people have this pressure, they feel this pressure writing for the New York Times. There's so much power behind your byline when you write for the Times. If you're a freelancer, that people often pull their punches for fiction reviews. And what you would get, they would tell you personally, the worst book they ever read, what you would get from the critic is 9 paragraphs of plot summary, and then hope they do better next time. And none of the sense of,
the real problem, it seems to me, is that there's a shortage of good critics. There aren't enough good critics, and there are fewer of them all the time. I mean, and it's a kind of, the whole profession of criticism is at a funny watershed, because we're at a moment now when, thanks to the internet, everyone's a critic, and everyone can get on there, and everyone has an opinion, and everybody's opinion on the internet is as good as, my opinion is as good as yours. Everybody, it's just, and it's just the more passionately you hold it, the better it is.
Yeah, what you're saying is true, but of course nobody
knows that. Yeah.
Everybody thinks that the review of the Times has more authority.
I think there's a backlash against so-called elite criticism.
No, of course the gatekeepers, the whole thing, but I certainly do think when I'm reviewing something that I'm affecting. They'll tell you in the introduction, this book took me 10 years. The book I'm reviewing right now, guy says, took him 7 years.
What no one talks about now, I don't think, nearly, I think this should be on page 1 of the New York Times, I think this is major news. People have talked for a while about the vanishing, as people call it, meaning the vanishing the way records now are out of our houses. We have, Spotify. We used to collect DVDs, and we used to have culture all around our rooms, our living rooms, and those things are all gone. And people thought that books would go the same way, that e-books would get rid of our books. They pretty much haven't. Book sales are doing pretty well. What's vanished are book reviews. There used to be all these alternative weeklies all across America. The Voice and the Phoenix, the most famous ones, but there were dozens. I know, because I wrote for all of them. And there were book sections in all the major newspapers, even the smaller ones. Even the Herald, the Ledger, the New Jersey paper used to run books. Star Ledger, sorry. And these book sections are just gone.
No, there used to be also a very lively, one of the things when the internet first came along, it was a very lively book scene on the internet. That's where I found you, Salon, which the Salon of today is unrecognizable. It was mostly books driven back in the day.
You go to London, there are 7 daily papers, they're all reviewing the same books. There's this back and forth ping pong sense, and there are all kinds of opinions, and you can say crazier things because other people will say different things. Now with the New York Times, you realize this might be the only review this book gets. I mean, that's plausible. Reynolds Price wrote in his memoir from 1995, that a serious book in America, when he first came of age as a writer, in the 40s, I think, a serious first novel might get 100 or so reviews.
Wow.
He said right now in 95, it might get about 16, 17. 20 some years later, 30 years later, that's easily 3 or 4. Serious reviews, major reviews. I mean, the time and music reviews don't mean what they used to. There's big hits would come down. Those are major, opinion.
They would put authors on the cover.
Right. At any rate, book reviews are just, really gone away to some degree.
Well, and it's regrettable because it seems to me that, you go into a bookstore now. I go into a bookstore and ostensibly I know the business. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what to buy. My experience is that people want to read, but what's precious to them is not their money, because books are still, I think, relatively bargain. It's their time.
Well,
and they want to invest their
Books
time.
aren't that expensive.
They want to invest their time wisely.
this is another reason people love negative reviews, because thank God I can write one off my list. Because you're always hearing about these great books, and everyone feels a million miles behind. And unless there's some winnowing, it's just got to be done.
No, this is why I thought one of the greatest things to happen to the literary culture in America was Oprah. And I'm sorry that she's still not doing it. She was a very trusted and reasonable and sensible gatekeeper, and we need them. And we don't have, if we're going to have questions from the audience, we should probably do that now.
What's that?
Do you want to just do one more question to the panel, then I'll roll the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry, what?
One more question for you.
One more question for you on the DS, and then I'll roll
Okay,
the mic.
so you started to touch on this. It's often said that negative reviews are easier to write
Much.
than, I don't agree, than positive reviews. I don't agree at all.
I sweat negative. I want to make sure that I really am saying the right thing. I don't want to get that wrong.
But I really know what I'm talking about with these things. Maybe not somebody or other's debut novel, but certainly ballet reviews. I mean, I've been doing it for 30 years.
But every ballet is different. Every choreographer is different. I mean, the reasons you're writing negatively.
They hired me to review. They hired you. They hired me. Actually, I am much less interested in writing. I'll just cancel the review, and I do it. I go to dinner after the show, and I call up my editor and say, I want to cancel. I just did it for my first review with that. I got a new editor, and I canceled the review from a Japanese restaurant. I just didn't want to do it. She's the biggest thing since Pina Bausch's death. She's the biggest thing in Germany, and I just didn't want to do the job. I just didn't want to do it to her. She's young enough. I just have other things to do with my life than to have the New Yorker. Once again, we're all very impressed with who we write for. So I too feel that the New Yorker, a really bad review in the New Yorker could be very damaging.
Well, so where are we then? I mean, where are we as critics if we're not willing to talk about the things that we don't think
Well,
work?
but the thing is, I just need more space. If 2 people were writing book reviews in the New Yorker, that would make a difference to me. That the other, you've got how many people writing book reviews for you?
3.
Yes. Oh, well, all right. The New Yorker's a funny business because it's there's no designated book review. Henry just makes.
But the New Yorker, isn't under this presumptive obligation. The New Yorker doesn't have to review anything. The people come to the New Yorker, come waiting to be surprised and pleased and delighted, all the wonderful things that the New Yorker does. People come to the New York Times expecting that certain things have to be reviewed, even if it's lousy. If it's a big book or a big movie or a big play or
I sit down with that thing on Sunday night and I go through it to find out what happened this week in book publishing. And
So now,
Yep.
are we ready now?
Yep.
Okay.
You're done. Yep, I'm going to the mic.
behind the curtain. We're going to have a few questions. Just keep your hands up. And I'll go by. A quick question. Can you talk about the challenges of reviewing memoirs? Is there any particular sensitivity that you feel in terms of approaching the material that's different than other kinds of criticism?
Do you want to take it, Dwight?
I review a fair number of, memoir is a very interesting field. I mean, who was it? Calvin Trillin said that he compared it to the nuclear arms race now in terms of the personal atrocity race. You know, everyone gets up, you know, the worst atrocity that happened to you, the more likely your book will sell a lot of copies. You know, so much gets said in memoir. It's such an elastic form. And it's just, memoirs are permanently interesting if they're well done. They come from so many areas. I mean, it's such a, you know, it's such a broad form that it's hard to make generalizations about. You know, I think it was Thoreau who said he wanted to count, you know, every man's life, every writer's life. I really enjoy the memoirs that people I care about as artists, and I gravitate towards those especially. Literary people, dance people, I love the things that are about their lives. I'm especially interested, it's a bit off topic, but I'm a big reader of diaries and letters and things like that. They're one of the best things that I read. Sort of concentrated, sort of more like at the bar after the performance than the performance itself, so I sort of like that feeling. And the best memoirs give you that feeling. Do you have a more specific question about memoir?
Just, I think it's, as you were saying, some people have read, you know, particularly challenging things in their lives. Is it hard to separate, I guess, the criticism of the subject matter, the way that it's written, and sort of the content? How do you sort of divvy up how to be critical about it?
I'm just a connoisseur, and I'm sure it's the same for both of you. I'm just literary delight. You know, I mean, I love good sentences. I love good words. I just, you know, a life well told is a good life in my, you know, it doesn't matter to me in terms of what, I mean, you want ballast, you know, you want interesting things to happen to this person. You want, you know, a good life is an interesting life. But, you know, a life can be fairly boring, and the right writer can just, you know, maybe.
And I would add to this that the same thing is true of reviews. I mean, I think that it's insufficiently appreciated. Reviews ought to be pleasant and stylish and entertaining in themselves. I think what people fail to realize sometimes is most people who read a review are not going to read the book. They're not going to go see the performance. So you need to give them, I think, something.
You need to tell them the story a little bit.
And in a stylish, pleasing way. One of the things that drives me bananas is how slovenly a lot of critical prose is. I think critics have, just like, critics are artists of a sort, minor artists, maybe if they're artists, and they have, just like other artists, they have an obligation to entertain. I agree.
Sometimes I feel as though they wrote it while they were sleeping. They wrote it with their left hand or something like that. They consider it a lesser job.
I can think of that line that Laurie's just that dictated but not read. So I'm just, you know, not really following into it.
How would you pick a book to review by a completely unknown author, first time? I mean,
Well, that's what I was asking before. Who's culling these so-called debut novels that the Times Book Review?
Well, the great advantage, that, as I said at the beginning, that the book review had, I think the staff is considerably smaller now than it was when I was there. And I should be added, the book review itself is smaller. It's about, the Sunday book review, it's about half the size of what it was.
Ditto the New Yorker.
You know, there was a staff of people, and I think were biased in favor of finding the new young writer, the new debut book. I mean, there's no, if you're doing Dwight's job or the job of the other people, there's no fun in saying, oh, new novel by Philip Roth, I guess we better review that one. The thrill of the job is
The most thrilling thing about my job is when I discover a new writer and help their career. And I think I've done that plausibly with a handful of people. And it's the best thing that I do, is find that.
It's also supposed to be an important part of your job.
Oh, yeah. And I spoke to this earlier when I say that I sit there and really read piles of books by first-time writers. I also, there's sort of a system, if you've lived as long in the literary sort of atmosphere as I have and both of you have, the little pings you hear. You know, a piece from a first writer's book will appear in the Paris Review or the Swanee Review or here and there, and things get picked up. And if you're reading these things, keeping an eye out, there's often some little thrumming on the wires before first novel's book comes out. Also, there are advance reviews in places like Publishers Weekly and Kirkus that reviews books in advance, and those can be interesting sometimes.
Very helpful.
Not that, but once in a while.
Yeah, I tried to use Publishers Weekly that way, but to get a jump on him. You know, it didn't work that well. But anyway, scouting is supposed to be a part of our job. You're supposed to be doing it. Certainly with answers. You're supposed to be able to notice boing, you know, and if you don't have it, there's a big problem.
Thank you. Just to latch on to something Mr. Garner said earlier, do you think that poetry is quicker to review than fiction, or what would that be?
I don't really mean that. But what I'm saying is that, you know, 1 week or a while ago, I reviewed Knausgaard, which is 1,000 pages. And then I go back and read one of them that I missed, which is another 600 pages. So, and the book I'm reviewing tomorrow is 112 pages. And, you know, it is poetry. I read it twice, but even reading it twice took 2 hours probably. So it's just talking about the sheer number of words on the page. Poetry can be easier. However, you know, there are many poets who write longer books, many poets who have to go back and read their 6 or 7 earlier books and read their criticism and often their reviews, and they've written other things. So it's always different.
I also think that poetry reviews are among the hardest to write because, again, going on my principle that you're writing for a general audience. You're writing for people that don't, I assume. I used to have this kind of discussion with Helen Vendler all the time. Helen Vendler was the poetry editor of the poetry critic for the New Yorker, and I was her editor. And I was always trying to say, you know, we're not writing for the insiders. You have to, and it's hard to make poetry appealing. Can be different.
What he's saying is extremely true. However, poetry reviews can be easy to write because quoting a chunk of poetry takes up a third of the observation. So all I have to do is say, this poet's pretty good about writing about trees, and he'll quote, and I'm halfway done. So that's what it is.
First of all, I just have to thank you for what you do, because it's very difficult out in the real world trying to make up your mind about what you want to read next.
Thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciate your work. But I guess everyone feels the same way. But really, when you said try to keep the reader in mind, I can't even imagine who you're writing for, because the New York Times is international, the New Yorker goes international. You see the responses from all over the world. And I find your job, I would think it's impossible to be able to present your opinion of a book that you know will strike to the heart of readers all over the world. That's pretty tough, to make it understandable to so many different readers.
Both as an editor and as a writer, I have a very simple kind of imaginary audience that I have in mind. It's my wife's book group. No, I'm serious. This is a bunch of, it's all women, who are very serious readers, all smart, all college educated. They're not experts in any one thing. They're all very smart. They're immensely curious, and they're well-informed, but as I say, not experts. They're who I have in mind when I edit or when I write. Will this make sense to them? Because I think that's as good as we can hope for.
I think of my mother.
What?
I think of my mother. When I'm trying to decide whether I have to identify who Cocteau was, I think of my mother. And would she need for me? And these days, by the way, there's much more pressure. Our kids are getting dumber, and
I was distressed the other day. So, in the piece I had in the New Yorker last week, I made mention of Dickens's Dotheboys Hall, and Henry stuck in from Nicholas Nickleby, and I thought, do we really need that?
No, you hate to sound dumb, you know? As if you didn't know that.
There's someone up here, a couple up here in the front.
In your scouting books, scouting new authors, does the name of the imprint, the editor, or the publisher matter?
I hate to say that it does, but it does a little bit.
Yes.
I mean, there's certain publishing houses that they're so prestigious, they get first crack at the good stuff for the most part. For one reason, they're seeing all the best stuff. That's one reason. Two, you get to know them, you realize they have pretty, they don't always see the stuff first. But, for example, there's a reason why Riverhead, this year, Riverhead Books has 3 of its books up for the National Book Award. 2 of them edited by Chip's daughter, who has incredible taste. And you learn that houses like Riverhead, like Rausch, Nelson Drew, like Knopf, get the first pick of the best stuff. So, you go to the farmer's market that gets the stuff fresh from the, you have to treat those books seriously. But we talked earlier, the real trick for me, the thing that I love doing is finding the book that's published by a press you've never heard of. And so you try to look for those. But you can't discount the weight of these that's because they're big, because they're talented. I mean,
There's such a thing as having a bad name.
what do you mean?
They're publishing houses.
There are publishing houses where, somebody said to me, Martha Duffy of the Times said to me, a St. Martin's book?
Well, they publish some great books, but St. Martin's throws a lot of stuff against the wall and hopes that a few things
That
stick
some
here, and they
of it's
do.
that-
And they publish some great stuff, but alas, a lot of it isn't so good.
Do they publish a lot of great stuff?
Yeah, they look at a biography or
Some.
something. Well, okay, but then once you try to go look at a biography from England or something, it's pretty great. And they published a novel I liked last year by this young Southern writer. I mean, it's like eating olive garden or something. I don't know. But anyway.